Hello everyone and welcome to IFST's Spring Conference 2021, Food Science and Technology, Thinking Smart, Acting Smart. Our first speaker is Professor Guy Poppy. Guy is Director of the Programme for Transforming the UK Food System for Healthy People and a Healthy Environment. This is a significant UKRI programme. The title of his presentation is Building back a better UK food system post-COVID and post-EU exit. Smart insights to place human and planetary health at the centre. I think you will agree that the project and the title of his talk seem to cover all the bases and therefore make a great plenary talk to set the scene for the week. Guy is based at the University of Southampton and has been in his current role since 2019. Many of you will no doubt know him from his time spent at the FSA as Chief Scientific Advisor. For more information about Guy and all of the speakers throughout the conference, please do visit the profiles on our event platform. So without further ado, I will hand over to Guy.
Thank you, Helen, for that kind introduction. And it's a great pleasure for me to return to give a talk at this conference. I gave a talk at the very start of when I was a Chief Scientific Advisor for the Food Standards Agency, and here I am today giving a talk again after having stood down from that role. You know, what a year we've had. The COVID pandemic has hit hard. While at the same time, whilst we're dealing with the post-EU exit. And so what I want to talk today about is how we can perhaps use smart insight to place human and planetary health at the centre of a food system, which we really do need to build back. I think it's a really exciting time to be involved in food systems research. Undoubtedly, we now know how critical food is to the health of the country, the implications that food plays in terms of the health of the world, in terms of, we know about that in terms of climate change. And in the spirit of this conference, we need to think and act smart if we're going to transform the UK food system and hopefully the world food system too, because we're obviously all integrally linked. What I want to discuss is looking at a range of metrics as to why the current food system is at a point in which it's perhaps beginning to need transformation. That's not to say it has its benefits. That's not to say it's enabled lots of people to be fed. But looking at the statistics, things do need to change. So if we look at health, here's health. What that shows us is that diet now is becoming the biggest risk of death in the world. 1 in 7 deaths in Britain are caused by diet. And we know now, even with a communicable disease like COVID, the interaction of diet and COVID in terms of whether it be to do your nutritional status, your weight, type 2 diabetes, and all these conditions are kind of very much linked. And we know that the cost to the NHS is increasing. And we know from the COVID pandemic how much the country admires and loves the NHS. And I think it's important that we act now to try and protect the NHS from this crisis. And I think it would be a crisis if we didn't address some of these issues. So here we have a range of figures which illustrate a worrying trend, actually. The trend, as you can see in the above, 3 figures are to do with children, and the bottom is to do with adults. What you can see is over the last 2 decades, an increasing percentage of society who have diabetes, are overweight, and in fact are obese. And that is leading to the health conditions that we've just discussed, and also the things feeding those are actually leading to some of the environmental issues that I will be discussing too. So if we look now at the figures in terms of, on the left hand side we have a series of key minerals, nutrients, etc. that are good to eat, and on the right hand side we have a series of products and nutrients which perhaps are less good to eat if you eat too much of them. And what that shows in terms of whether it be in the global status in the blue here, or in our case the national status, which is in red, on the, shall we say, the more beneficial food groups and components, we are to the left, i.e. eating less than we should of these components. And on the right hand side, you can see, with the exception of vegetables and whole grain, we're to the right of those, illustrating a dietary kind of issue. So moving on, if we look at the environment, so what do we know about the environment? Well, what we know is that the tremendous efforts post the Second World War, we know from Henry Dimblby's National Food Strategy, the incredible success that was in terms of actually driving up the productivity in the country. We do know that has had some issues, whether it be to do with amount of greenhouse gases and the increasing concerns about the climate, biodiversity loss, which underpins pretty much all of life as we know it, soil degradation, aquatic ecosystems, freshwater use. We know that the current way that we go about producing the world's food is having a consequence on planetary health. And the IPCC report shows that is in a kind of a critical tipping point. And a lot of this is driven by the kind of focusing on maximising the amount of calories that are produced per unit area, as against the amount of people that are sustainably and healthy fed per unit area. And I think that's one of the shifts that we kind of need to make. But if we look at some of these environmental targets, so here we have a metrics on the environmental performance index, we can begin to rank countries, and they look at ecosystem vitality and a number of measures underneath that, and environmental health and a number of measures on that, and then you can map where a country fits on that. So at the top right hand you see obviously the Nordic country like Finland or a country like Switzerland is ecosystem vital, and the environmental health is high, where some of the less fortunate countries like Burundi and India are down towards the left hand side of that. And I'm pleased to say on this metric, or these metrics, the United Kingdom comes in number 6, with only places like Sweden, Denmark, France and Switzerland above it, and Malta. But what I suppose is worth flagging here is that we know even in the United Kingdom that we have had some of these environmental issues. So therefore, even on a world scale, one is doing well within the UK. The consequence here is it is the world that needs to actually change if it's going to improve things. And then if we look at some of the economics, the kind of final metric that we might be looking at here. And what we can do is, if we look at, for every £1 a consumer in the UK spends on food, we know that the additional costs of about £1 are incurred to society. That's kind of addressing some of the health issues, some of the environmental issues, etc., associated with the way we go about producing and consuming food. Now, the problem here is if we put a full economic costing or transferred across, some of the most vulnerable people in society will be hit harder. So this is a difficult problem to kind of address, but it is worth kind of flagging. If we look at trade, what we have here is this from 2017, but this is the Chatham House's resource trade database. And if we look at just agricultural products, we could obviously include some of the drink and other food components here, but agricultural products, we currently import £37 billion worth of agricultural products, but we only export 14.4 billion. So there's a trade deficit of 22.6 billion pounds. Here is a big question. In terms of the future of the world, do we want to close that trade deficit? Do we want to actually become more self-sufficient? Does that involve dietary change? Or do we need to perhaps keep this as the situation as it is and just therefore stabilise some of these kind of relationships, etc., and the opportunities and the risks as we leave the European single market on these particular issues? So if we look at those metrics and then we start thinking to ourselves, okay, what is going on then? Well, these two figures here show us something quite interesting. So on the left-hand side, we have the picture of what the dietary plate should look like, the so-called Eat Well guide, if one was to eat for a healthy kind of lifestyle and actually result in a healthy person. And on the right-hand side, it illustrates what's actually being produced. And what you can see, there is quite a big mismatch between this. So the really obvious differences are, if you look at things like sugar in blue, in dark blue, fruit and vegetables in green, and oils and spreads in purple, the difference between what Eat Well suggests as against what is produced are quite different. So this comes back to the heart of the fact that actually the world's producing things which are somewhat linked to perhaps what people are demanding, and that is quite different than what would be good from a healthy diet. And we know that in terms of the production of some of those things on the right hand side there, that has environmental consequences too. And it's things like that which led to a whole range of kind of reports which are currently coming out. Perhaps the one which grabbed quite a lot of attention was the Eat Lancet Commission, which flagged that the food in the Anthropocene, as they call it, i.e. the man-influenced period in geological time, represents one of the greatest health and environmental challenges of the 21st century. And I think that is right, because I think what many people are quite clearly aware of is that if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, most of them can be influenced by getting food right. And so therefore that brings me on to what is getting food right. Well, I think what getting food right is now the recognition that we need a food systems approach. And what do I mean by food systems? Well, we often used to talk about food security, and then people started getting concerned about whether nutrition is really captured in the food security kind of discussion. And then other people saying, well, in terms of the food security, it's still kind of dominated by food production type thinking. And just in the last few years, a lot more traction has been given to the concept of a food system. And we need to recognize that we are dealing with a complex system. And therefore, when we intervene, we are aware of the effects that our intervention will have on the bit we're trying to change, and the potential indirect and perhaps unintended consequences of what we're trying to do. So this is the petal or the flower diagram developed by Kelly Parsons and others at City University, which we use quite a lot. And in that you can see these kind of interacting circles of politics, health, environment, society and economy, the food chains, and you can see from the arrows the sort of systems type nature of what we're dealing with, and therefore what we need to do in terms of transformation in the food system of the future is to think smart and act smart in terms of we are dealing with a system, and that's the way that we need to go about trying to transform that with the outcome of healthier people and a healthier environment. That's no mean feat, though. It's very challenging. This is a diagram that I used to use when I was at the Food Standards Agency, which illustrates to you the size of what we're talking about. So effectively 4 million people employed, 112 billion added value to the economy of the food and drink sector. That is greater than planes and cars added together. More than 600,000 food businesses in the UK. And then in terms of some details here about Food Standards Agency work, in terms of the amount of contamination, the amount of food fraud, etc. So therefore, in changing to this system and the consequences of how you regulate it, the consequences of how you actually assure the safety and the standards of it, is a grand challenge, but it's one that we can't walk away from. We need to do it. The business as usual is not going to be the answer. It's got us to the point that we've got. It has had its benefits, but I think some real strain to the system has come in. I wrote a short while ago a paper called Rethinking the Food System for Human Health in the Anthropocene, and this was in a special edition of a journal which was looking at all issues around how man was changing the planet that we lived on. And I was asked to speak about in terms of food. And in that, what I kind of focused in on is that if we kind of somewhat put human health at the centre of this food system, so that what we are trying to do is to develop a food system which makes it easy for people to consume and want to consume and afford to consume diets which would be good for them, and the very way that they are produced would be good for the planet. Because if you get human health right, and you perhaps therefore have some of the aspects in the eat well plate, the likelihood is that you will actually also improve environmental health. If you take something like fruit and vegetables, the very nature by which fruit and vegetables can be produced in terms of a heterogeneous, quite diverse cropping regime, you can therefore imagine that the biodiversity, the soil erosion, the sort of greenhouse gas emissions, etc., as long as you use the right farming method, can actually reduce the environmental impact at the same time as producing the food which is actually going to be beneficial to human health. So these things can be linked, and that's what this paper is all about, and I would suggest you go off and read it. So that brings me to the program that I want to kind of flag to you. When I was a chief scientific advisor, Chris Whittier, which I'm sure you all are very familiar now in his role at the Department of Health, and Ian Boyd at DEFRA, we sat down and we all had a conversation about the fact that the current UK food system was creating environmental issues that were worrying DEFRA, food issues which were worrying the Food Standards Agency, and importantly, health issues which was really beginning to concern Chris Whitty and the Department of Health way before we were thinking about COVID. And we went about working with the research councils and other government departments like Public Health England were brought in, although they're underneath, obviously, the Department of Health, to discuss what we might do about that. And we were very successful in developing a project together with the academic community and these research councils, ranging from the medical to the social and economic to the environmental and the biotechnological, to develop this program of interdisciplinary research, where we were going to ultimately transform UK diets to be healthier, more sustainable, change the behaviour of actors across the food system, model the interdependencies, co-produce, very important, working with many of the people hopefully that are listening on this call, and importantly, produce a pipeline of skilled people, a new generation of food systems thinkers and food systems leaders. We've had a very successful launch of some consortia. So this was a £25 million call, of which we've funded 4 projects over 5 years. And these projects are very much at the heart of what we're trying to do. So Bob Darty and a team at the University of York have a project called Fix Our Food, focused in on Yorkshire as a food system, and very much working on kind of regenerative type thinking and equitable health. A lot of work with young children, the food economies and the farming systems to kind of regenerate, rethink, rebuild what you have, and then use Yorkshire as a role model for the wider country and aspects of food commissions, develop one in York and then using it as a case study. Second project, Peter Jackson and teams at University of Sheffield. This is a kind of very project looking at trying to actually use smart technology to kind of address issues such as biofortification, decreased fibre consumption, etc., linked with smart social science to kind of explore how we can bring that technology into products which actually people want to eat and actually are going to consume at the right levels. Carol Wagstaff and a team led out of Reading University working on disadvantaged communities. This has been highlighted so much during COVID, how disadvantaged communities and health inequalities are really, really suffering much more than perhaps other parts of society. And her project is going to be working with those communities and 4 case studies in the country to try to develop desirable, sustainable and affordable healthy products. And then finally, using Birmingham and the West Midlands as the focus point to how you transform an urban food system like that for planetary and population health, using kind of models to kind of base on real world data what an intervention looks like, and then models to project further into the future to look at the kind of the longer term impacts of their work. Really, really exciting work. We've also just launched a Centre for Doctoral Training. This is going to train more than 60 PhD students. All of them will be doing 3-month placements in organisations like the private sector, the third sector, or government, led by the University of Greenwich, as I said, involving 6 or 7, I can't remember, 6 or 7 institutions, ranging from universities to research institutes like Rothamsted. And this is going to, I think, over the next 5 or 6 years, create the next generation of people understanding the UK food system, trained and wanting to kind of forge new careers, helping us maintain the momentum forward. And this is something that the National Food Strategy and Henry Dimbleby and his team are very keen on, because it's it's the future, it's the way forward. And then finally, even though now we currently have about 30 British universities involved, we have more than 100 private organisations involved, we now have the final call of the programme for more sort of pump primed type project, ranging from 250,000 to 2 million. And we're looking at 3 themes which are really identified from the portfolio of work we currently got, could do a little bit more in. 1, transforming a food environment. 2, sustainable nutrition across the food system. And 3, food imports and domestic production. These are live as we speak, and expressions of interest we'll be hearing in the summer to develop further. I urge you all to become involved in these projects if people contact you and say, we're through to the next round, we'd quite like to work with you. So we've already done some work, and I think that's important to say. So John Ingram and his team did a piece of work called In Mapping the UK Food System, which has shown us quite a lot about the scale, both in terms of economics and people employed, of the UK food system. We've got a piece of work being done by Kelly Parsons on the policy map and policy levers, and that will be published very soon. Really interesting, looking at things like public procurement and the role that that might make. And then finally, we're looking at how businesses have behaved to COVID and what we have learnt from the COVID situation, which we might be able to then use for transforming the system of the future. Here is a nice diagram from that mapping the UK food system work that John Ingram and his team did in Oxford. And what that illustrates to you, which we kind of knew, but it's nice to have this in graphics here, is the scale of like catering and retail, this is in terms of economics, and processing, as against the kind of pre-farm gate work in terms of farming, input supplies, etc. We did know this, but importantly, when we look at the portfolio work we're doing, we tend to often get a lot of work at the sort of pre-farm. We get a lot of work at the kind of consumption end, and there's this missing middle, processing, catering, retailing, which we really do have to try to engage more with, both the academic community, but hopefully the private sector. Lots of people listening today hopefully will say, yeah, there's more we can do in this space, and we need to get to work together, to act smart in terms of actually working together. So, thinking smart or acting smart, that is the focus of this conference. And I just want to kind of finish a little bit in terms of some of my thoughts in terms of how this might move forward in terms of addressing the problem I illustrated at the beginning and the kind of what I think is a really great opportunity in terms of the funding portfolio and programme to perhaps help generate some of the solutions. Firstly, I think there is the question of, what might we learn from COVID? Because the fact there is that it really has shocked the system in a way which we might have known some of the things, but not all of them. The just-in-time algorithms have often been criticised, and lots of people are criticising them and saying, oh, that's what happened, why the supermarket shelves were empty. But on the other hand, they actually did respond quite well, albeit a bit late. It's exposed health inequality. Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty, who I know well from my work when I was in government, often said very early on in the COVID crisis, is the one take-home message which hit from the first few weeks was health inequality. And there is a real need to address that. The environmental costs and consequences of current global food system. Originated in evidence suggests it originated in a wet food market. That then went into people, and then people travelled around the world, and we've had various incidences of commodities, fish, etc., moving about the world, potentially transmitting the virus. So what do we know about that in terms of, are we going to respond by being more self-sufficient, developing more resilience, developing smarter technology to detect things and shut them down quickly? Lots of questions here which we could address. So what will dinner look like in 20 years? In 20 years in this transformed food system, will dinner be such that we actually do have a healthier population and a healthier planet? And one of the ways that you can do that is to use foresight and horizon scanning. And I'm just going to illustrate some work that I've been doing in this space to kind of offer a little bit of an insight into this. So here is the view, scenario analysis, when you try to project forward to what the future might look like, and then perhaps on midpoints revisit your kind of thoughts. So this is a little bit of kind of foresight stroke horizon scanning work which I led, which I commissioned when I was at the Food Standards Agency, and we asked the think tank RAND to look at what's called a PESTLE analysis, to look at the kind of industry, technology, consumer environment, a sort of food systems type approach to the food system and how it is evolving. And using that type of thing, you can begin to kind of cluster around circular economy, industry for novel foods, etc. And we went one stage further in that work, and I asked them to actually take particular things. Here we have alternative proteins, sensors, food waste, etc. And what we have here is the size of the circle is the amount of integration and interaction. So the kind of, shall we say, the size of the node, and then the colour in this case is with reference and implications to Food Standards Agency. So this is to do with safety and standards. But if you're in DEFRA or public health or something like that, it can be different. And what's good about this is it enables you to think quickly about prioritisation in terms of actually, if you were worrying about things, you'd pick a big node that's bright red. And you perhaps might not focus so much on a small node which is blue. And so this kind of mapping and beginning to kind of connect things, etc., begins to enable you to think about where we should put our attention. Scenario analysis is another important way. Here we have the World Economic Forum, and they looked at two uncertainties. The way you do scenario analysis is you identify two axes, or typically you identify two axes which you think have uncertainty. So in this case, there's demand shift, and therefore whether the world become more resource intensive on the left or more resource efficient on the right. That's a sort of sustainability question. And then on the vertical axis we have markets. So will we become more globalized at the top, high connectivity, or more self-sufficient and insular at the bottom, low connectivity? And that creates four scenarios. Top left there, is not a nice scenario in a highly connected world, but it's drained of its resources. Top right, quite a nice scenario. I believe it's quite a nice scenario in which, well connected and living within one's means. And then we have the other two scenarios at the bottom there. And then what we can do, for instance, is we can actually perhaps pitch where we are today. So you might argue that we are resource intensive and not that much. It's a survival of the richest type situation, and that if there's business as usual, we end up in that top left box, which is why I think we need to transform the system. But optimally, which is I think where we might be trying to transform it to, is in the box on the top right there, the open source sustainability. And then the question is how do you get from where you are today to where you need to be? And I think, and I hope, that the research program that I've described to you will be a very important way of enabling us to do that. So talking about technology then, so what is the role of smart technology? Well, I think there's a great role here. Blockchains, again, when I was at the Food Standards Agency, we used distributed ledger technology such as blockchain to be able to offer assurance and confidence, in that case in the meat supply chain. But there are others, in terms of assurance in terms of particular components. So if you have a food hypersensitivity and the blockchain technology is used, perhaps you don't need labels that say may contain, because you know that it does not contain, and therefore you are being able to be confidently to say that and make it easier for people to make choices. Sensors. whether human inspections in abattoirs, for instance, whether or surveillance in general, whether we can use sensors to replace kind of humans or to enable humans to focus. So, for instance, a lot of surgeons now, ophthalmic surgeons, use artificial intelligence and sensors to look in people's eyes, and then only ones which aren't matching a certain pattern get referred up to see a real consultant, and that optimizes the use of a resource. Gene editing. Can we edit out allergens? Can we improve the nutrition? So maybe 1 a day of a super crop rather than 5 a day. Can it make things much more efficiency? And I know there's a lot of interest and excitement about digital twin technology and how we might optimize a complex system in real time so that we can respond quickly to that. But at the other side of the things is the sort of more social science aspects, smarter people, being smart about people and cultural shifts. For example, dark kitchens and how quickly they arose associated with the cultural aspects of people buying flats and that in parts of London and other cities, no kitchens, eating out a lot, bringing food in. Consumer trends. We know that Generation Z is increasingly interested in veganism as a way to try to protect the planet. That has implications in terms of the diet and the nutrients that those individuals will get, and or making the right choices for the climate. But understanding those shifting consumer patterns important. Communication, we know a lot about this in terms of COVID, but the role of experts, perhaps the role of labels, the role of influencers, and how if we want to communicate to enable people to make choice, enable people to actually make decisions which suit their lifestyle or their kind of values, how best to do that. And then finally, this question of whether we should be more global or more local, which again, I think prior to COVID and the sort of Trumpism and various aspects of kind of tariff wars, even to some extent, the situations we're in the UK as we've left Europe, of whether we want to be an increasingly globalized country or a more local country. And it's on that last point that I just illustrate in my final slide. Here is some analysis that I've been doing looking at trade 2014 to 2017. So this is just prior to the Brexit vote and just prior obviously to the COVID situation. And here we have a range of minerals, calcium, zinc, iron, and vitamin A and vitamin C. And I did, and looking at from a scenario analysis point of view, what we have is that on the vertical axis we have 100 at the top of the diagram. We have 100% plant-only diet, and at the bottom of the axis, slightly unlikely, but we have a 0% plant diet, i.e. totally meat. And on the horizontal axis, we have a situation in which the domestic supply is on the left hand side 100% domestic, and on the right hand side effectively not domestic, 100% import. And what you've got here is a map situation of where the current micronutrients, which are very important for us, come from. These micronutrients are very important in terms of COVID and that too. So we can see that actually the Eat Lancet scenario is in that top left-hand box, an increasingly self-sufficient plant-based diet. And you can see from the micronutrients that we currently have, we are quite some way from that. So therefore the question is, how can we act smart, transform the food system to enable us to actually respond to changing dynamics, changing requests and requirements. And that's where I want all of us to kind of think and focus. And I look forward to the questions. And on that, thanks for listening. I now hand back to Helen, who's going to host a question and answer session. And I'm really excited about kind of working with all of you to make this important thing happen.